When a black nanny is seen walking with two white children through an affluent neighborhood, suspicion turns deadly. Police swarm, neighbors whisper, and accusations fly. Arrested for a crime she didn't commit, her secret identity shocks everyone, revealing a truth that will change lives and shatter prejudices forever. The morning sun spilled like liquid gold across the manicured lawns of Oak Ridge Heights, the kind of neighborhood where roses seemed to bloom a little brighter and gates swung open silently to welcome luxury cars home. Every house was a statement, each driveway polished enough to mirror the sky. To outsiders, Oak Ridge Heights looked perfect, an enclave of wealth, order, and good breeding. But beneath the glossy exterior, whispers of class, color, and suspicion hung like shadows that refused to leave. On that particular Tuesday, the air carried a deceptive calm. Joggers in sleek gear padded rhythmically past wrought iron fences, dogs trotted neatly on designer leashes, and landscapers in green uniforms hummed quietly to themselves as they trimmed hedges into geometric perfection. Nobody suspected the storm that was about to erupt over something as ordinary as a woman walking down the street with children. Her name was Marissa Cole. To most who didn't know her, she was the Nanny, a tall black woman with warm eyes and a gait that carried quiet strength. She dressed simply, jeans, sneakers, a pale blouse, but she carried herself with a kind of unspoken authority. At her side, two small children walked, 6-year-old Grace and 4-year-old Ethan Whitmore, the youngest heirs of one of the neighborhood's wealthiest families. Marissa wasn't just their caretaker, she was their protector, their confidant, their daily constant in a world where parents were often absent, consumed by board meetings, charity galas, and extended business trips. Grace clutched Marissa's hand with unshakable trust, while Ethan chattered endlessly about dinosaurs, blissfully unaware of the eyes narrowing from across the street. Mrs. Langley, an elderly widow with too much time and too sharp an eye, stood behind her lace curtains. She watched Marissa and the children with suspicion that had long fermented into paranoia. In her mind, black women did not belong in Oak Ridge Heights unless they were scrubbing floors, not strolling casually with white children who looked nothing like them. She had seen Marissa before, but today something in her chest tightened, an old prejudice flaring with sudden urgency. She reached for her phone, dialed 911, and reported what she believed was a kidnapping. Within minutes, the hum of ordinary suburbia shattered under the scream of sirens. Police cruisers, lights flashing, roared into the neighborhood as if descending on a criminal mastermind. Joggers froze, sprinklers hissed. The landscapers stopped mid-trim. The children blinked in confusion as 3 squad cars screeched to a halt in front of Marissa. "Hands where we can see them!" An officer barked, already stepping out with his hand hovering near his holster. Marissa froze. Her heart raced, but her face remained calm. She'd seen this before, in different places, under different circumstances, but she had never imagined it happening while holding the hands of the children she loved as if they were her own. Grace whimpered, tugging at Marissa's hand. Ethan, sensing the sudden change in energy, buried his face into Marissa's thigh. "Officer, please," Marissa began, her voice steady but urgent. "Step away from the children, now!" The words ripped through the air like a whip. Neighbors began spilling onto porches, phones recording, eyes wide with morbid fascination. It was a spectacle. A black woman accused of stealing children in a white neighborhood. The whispers began even before the officers moved in. "She doesn't belong here." "Who are those kids?" "Oh my God, is she—" Grace, her voice small but piercing, cried out, "She's our nanny! Stop! She didn't do anything!" But her words were drowned in the chaos. One officer reached for Ethan, trying to pull him away, but the boy screamed, clinging harder to Marissa's jeans. Marissa's hands were forced behind her back, cold steel cuffs biting into her wrists. The children wailed, their voices shaking with terror. "Let her go! That's our Marissa!" Grace shouted, her small fists striking against an officer's leg to no avail. The scene grew uglier by the second. Officers tried to comfort the children, but their attempts only made it worse. The more they pulled, the more the children fought, crying out for the woman who was being shoved into the back of a police cruiser as if she were a criminal. Inside the car, Marissa's chest heaved, but she refused to let tears fall. She knew too well that crying would be seen as weakness, or worse, guilt. She stared out the window at the sea of judgmental faces, each one silently condemning her without knowing the truth. She told herself to breathe, to wait, to let the truth surface when the time came. But deep inside, a question gnawed at her. What if the truth didn't matter this time? At the precinct, the interrogation was swift and cold. Detectives pounded her with questions. Where were you taking the children? Who are you working with? Do you have an accomplice? They never once paused to consider that she might simply be who she said she was, the children's caretaker. Her repeated insistence, call their parents, the Whitmores, they'll tell you everything, was brushed aside with thinly veiled skepticism. Meanwhile, back in Oak Ridge Heights, news traveled faster than wildfire. The Whitmores' phone buzzed incessantly, texts flying in. Do you know what's happening? We saw Marissa on the news. Are the kids safe? They said she was arrested. Catherine Whitmore, the children's mother, was halfway across the world in Geneva on a humanitarian panel. Her husband, Jonathan, was in New York for an urgent financial summit. Both parents dropped everything when they learned what happened, their voices shaking as they screamed at the police over international calls. That woman is family. Release her immediately. But bureaucracy moves slowly, and prejudice moves faster. For hours, Marissa sat in a holding cell, surrounded by hardened criminals, while the children were left traumatized in the care of social services. And yet, the longer the police dug into Marissa's background, the stranger the story became. Her records were pristine. No criminal history, no traffic violations, nothing. Her resume, provided by the Whitmores years ago, checked out. But there were gaps, periods of her life unaccounted for, years where she seemed to vanish. Curiosity piqued, suspicion deepened. Who was this woman really? When the truth finally began to emerge, it stunned everyone. Marissa Cole wasn't just a nanny. She wasn't just a woman of quiet strength with a heart for children. She carried an identity that no one in Oak Ridge Heights could have imagined, an identity that explained her composure under fire, her authority, her mysterious past. But that revelation, shocking, undeniable, was still hours away. For now, all Oak Ridge Heights knew was the image burned into their minds. A black woman in handcuffs accused of kidnapping, surrounded by the tears of two white children who only wanted her back. The whispers wouldn't die down, not yet. They would grow, twist, and spread like vines until the truth finally tore them apart. The fluorescent lights inside the holding cell buzzed relentlessly, flickering in a rhythm that gnawed at Marissa's nerves. The hard bench beneath her seemed designed to sap strength from her body, and the faint stench of stale sweat clung to the air. A woman across from her muttered incoherently. Another stared blankly at the wall, her eyes glazed with hopelessness. Marissa sat upright, her wrists marked with red welts from the cuffs, her mind circling the same questions. How did this happen? How did walking children home turn into this nightmare? She replayed the scene again and again in her head, each memory more surreal than the last. The screech of the police cruiser, Grace's desperate scream, Ethan's tiny hands clawing at her jeans. Those children trusted her. They looked at her as though she were invincible. And yet she had been powerless, dragged away before their eyes. A new fear clawed at her. What if that trust was broken forever? Meanwhile, across town, Grace and Ethan sat huddled in a sterile room at Child Protective Services. Grace's eyes were swollen from crying, her hair a tangled mess from the struggle. Ethan clutched a toy dinosaur given to him by a social worker, but even his beloved Triceratops couldn't shield him from confusion. "I want Marissa," Ethan sobbed over and over as if the repetition might make it true. Grace, though older and more perceptive, was caught between fear and fury. She tried to explain, tried to scream at the adults in charge that Marissa wasn't a kidnapper, that she was their safe place. But the words bounced off the social workers, who offered only soothing tones and hollow reassurances. Back in Oak Ridge Heights, the neighborhood was ablaze with gossip. Porch conversations turned venomous, phone calls whispered wild theories, and social media feeds filled with half-truths and speculation. "She was probably planning to sell them," one neighbor hissed. "Or maybe she was part of a trafficking ring," another suggested. "I always knew something was off about her." But there were quieter voices, too. those who had seen Marissa's devotion, who had watched her patiently chase Ethan on the lawn or gently braid Grace's hair on the porch steps. They hesitated, unsure whether to defend her or remain silent. After all, in Oak Ridge Heights, reputation was currency, and speaking out against the tide was costly. At the precinct, Detective Ramos paced the narrow hallway, files tucked under his arm. He wasn't convinced this was a simple case. The reports didn't add up. The nanny had been with the Whitmores for years without issue. No one could find a shred of evidence to suggest she had ever harmed anyone. Yet the arrest was made in broad daylight and public pressure was mounting. His partner, Detective Simmons, shrugged. It's cut and dry. Neighbor saw something suspicious, called it in. She resisted when we intervened. Case closed. Ramos frowned. Resisted? You mean she was holding the kids' hands? That's not resisting, that's protecting. Simmons rolled his eyes. You're reading too much into it. Look, she's a nanny. They get paid to do a job, doesn't mean she's above suspicion. But Ramos couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. He returned to his desk, pulling up Marissa's background check again. The gaps in her timeline gnawed at him. There were years where she seemed to disappear. No job history, no school records, no tax filings. It was as if she'd fallen off the map. People don't just vanish like that, not without reason. As night fell, Jonathan Whitmore landed in New York and stormed straight to the first available flight back to his family. His phone buzzed nonstop with messages from Catherine, who was scrambling to cut her trip short in Geneva. Both parents were furious, their anger directed squarely at the police department that had dared to lay hands on their children's caregiver. But beneath their rage was guilt. They knew too well how essential Marissa was, how she filled in the gaps of their absence, how she became the steady presence their wealth and schedules could not provide. To see her treated this way was not just injustice, it was personal betrayal. By morning, the headlines blared across every local news outlet. Black nanny arrested for kidnapping white children in Oak Ridge Heights. Community in shock after daytime arrest. Questions rise about who this woman really is. The photographs were damning. Marissa in handcuffs, her head held high but her eyes shadowed with pain, framed against the backdrop of police cars. The children's screams were captured in shaky, cell phone footage already gone viral. The public was divided. Some rallied in Marissa's defense, pointing to the parents' fury and the children's pleas as proof of her innocence. Others demanded accountability, convinced that appearances told the whole story. For every voice that cried injustice, another spat suspicion, revealing the fracture lines of a society still bound by prejudice. In her cell, Marissa tried to shut out the noise of the world. She sat cross-legged, eyes closed, breathing steadily. She had learned long ago how to summon calm in chaos, how to still her heartbeat when fear threatened to consume her. Meditation wasn't just a practice for her, it was survival. Because Marissa Cole wasn't an ordinary nanny. But she wasn't ready to reveal that, not yet. Detective Ramos eventually approached her cell, leaning against the bars with cautious curiosity. You don't strike me as the panicked type, he said, studying her. Most people in your shoes would be begging, crying, pleading for us to believe them. You're different. Marissa opened her eyes slowly, her gaze steady. Because I've been through worse than this. Ramos tilted his head. Worse than being accused of kidnapping? Worse than being branded a criminal in front of 2 children who love you? Her lips curved into something between a smile and a grimace. You'd be surprised. The detective hesitated, then lowered his voice. Who are you, Marissa, really? She said nothing, not yet. The time would come to reveal the truth. But not to him. Not until she was certain the Whitmores were back. Not until she was certain the children were safe. For now, silence was her shield. Across town, the children's voices had not wavered. Grace refused to eat, refusing even the cookies offered by social services. Until someone listened. She scrawled shaky letters on a piece of paper, demanding that Marissa be freed. Ethan's cries echoed through the halls long after bedtime, his small voice hoarse from repeating the same words. I want Marissa. Bring her back. And in Oak Ridge Heights, Mrs. Langley sat smugly on her porch, sipping tea as though she had saved the day. She replayed the footage on her phone again and again, satisfied that her vigilance had exposed danger. She did not consider that she had unleashed a storm far greater than she could control, a storm that would soon turn back on her with fury. Because Marissa Cole's story was only beginning to surface, and when it did, Oak Ridge Heights and the world would never see her the same way again. The truth finally surfaced not in the interrogation room, nor through whispered gossip, but when Jonathan and Catherine Whitmore stormed into the precinct. Catherine's voice sliced through the station like glass, her face pale with fury. "You arrested the wrong person," she spat. "That woman you dragged in like a criminal has raised my children with more love and loyalty than half this neighborhood shows their own. Release her, now!" The police chief shuffled nervously, but Jonathan's words landed heavier. "You didn't just arrest our nanny. You arrested a decorated veteran, an intelligence officer who spent years serving this country in ways you'll never understand." The room fell silent. All eyes snapped back to the cell where Marissa sat calmly, as if waiting for this moment. She rose slowly, her posture straight, her presence suddenly undeniable. "Yes," she said, her voice firm. "I served 8 years in the Army, Intelligence Division, 3 tours overseas. I've pulled children out of war zones, carried them across minefields, watched them cling to me the same way your officers tore Grace and Ethan from my arms. And after I left that life, I chose this one, to care for these children because they became my home." Detective Ramos swallowed hard, realization dawning. The composure, the discipline, the unflinching eyes. It all made sense now. Catherine stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached for the bars. "They need her," she whispered, her voice breaking. "And so do we." The chief, red-faced with embarrassment, ordered Marissa's release. The clank of the cuffs falling to the ground echoed like a judgment overturned. When Marissa stepped out of the precinct, the children were waiting. Grace flew into her arms, tears streaming down her face. Ethan clung to her neck as if he'd never let go again. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted, but none of it mattered. For the first time since the nightmare began, she was whole again. With them. The Whitmores stood behind her, fierce in their support. Jonathan announced publicly that the family would pursue legal action against the department, while Catherine's statement cut deeper. "If our society cannot see beyond skin to character, then it is broken. Marissa is not just our nanny, she is our family." As the crowd buzzed, Mrs. Langley shrank back into the shadows, her triumph soured into shame. The neighborhood that had once whispered suspicion now whispered something else: regret. Marissa held the children tighter, her gaze lifting to the horizon. She had carried secrets, endured prejudice, and been branded a criminal for her love. But in the end, the truth shone brighter than fear. And for Grace and Ethan, there was never any question. She wasn't their nanny. She was their hero. In a world full of noise, we follow the quiet truth stories that reveal, awaken, and transform. If this story moved you, like, comment, and subscribe for more untold narratives that challenge perception and stir the soul. Hit the bell so you never miss when the compass points us to the next hidden truth. This is Hidden Compass Stories, where every story leads somewhere deeper.